You are already inside it, and you don't know it yet. You lying there, with your phone glowing softly beside you, eyes a little grainy from the day thoughts still pacing in tight circles. Somewhere between the pillow and the ceiling, your mind is still trying to solve problems that do not belong to this hour. And yet floating through the air around you, landing on your sheets, drifting through the beam of your screen, there are tiny worlds you cannot see. A speck of dust passes in front of your face, invisible in the dim light. And if we could fall through it together, it would open like a universe. Tonight, this isn't a lesson or a test. This is a relaxing science story to fall asleep to a slow walk through scientific oddities for deep sleep. You don't have to remember any of it. You can let each detail fade as soon as you hear it. This is sleepy science for overthinking minds at night. And if your thoughts start to blur and wander, that isn't a problem. That is the plan. Imagine that one dust speck, the kind that sometimes glitters when sunlight sneaks through your curtains in the morning. It looks like nothing like a mistake in the air, but under a microscope, the same speck becomes a jagged asteroid made of life and history. A fragment of skin, a grain of soil, a shred of fabric, the fossil of a pollen grain from a flower you never saw. Each tiny piece carries ridges like mountains' valleys so deep that a bacterium could spend its entire existence exploring only one corner. You can let your shoulders soften as you picture it. The room around you can stay exactly as it is. You don't have to fix your posture or control your thoughts. Your breath can fall into its own slow rhythm, in and out, while we quietly shrink ourselves down, as if your whole body were becoming as small as one drifting particle in the air. On your skin right now, on your pillow, on the cable of your headphones, there may be microscopic creatures called tardigrades, little water bears. They are so small that several of them could stand side by side along the width of a single human hair. Under magnification, they look like plump, slow-moving bears with too many legs and tiny searching mouths. To them, the weave of your pillowcase is a vast canyon of cliffs and caves. You don't have to see them clearly in your mind. Just the suggestion is enough. Somewhere in the softness beneath your head, there could be an entire expedition of water bears trudging through the fibers, clinging to threads the way mountaineers cling to ropes. They do not know that they are lying under the cheek of a tired human, listening to a calm, slow story for adults who can't turn off their thoughts at night. They simply exist, patient and ancient, walking through cotton valleys as if it were the whole universe. Tardigrades are experts at almost dying without really dying. When their world dries out, when the thin film of water they need disappears, they curl into themselves, squeeze all their limbs inward, and enter a glassy sleep called cryptobiosis. They let most of the water leave their bodies and replace it with protective sugars that form a kind of internal glass. In that state, they can survive long stretches of dryness and cold. Then, when water finally touches them again, they slowly unfold as if waking from a dream and continue on. If your own body feels tired down to the bone, it can be comforting to know there are tiny astronauts under your pillow who have survived harsh conditions by simply becoming still. Scientists have even sent tardigrades into space. Exposed to vacuum and radiation, many of them later woke up and continued living as if they had simply taken a very long nap. You don't have to be that tough. Tonight, your biggest mission is much smaller. Simply lying here, allowing your nervous system to realize that for a little while, nothing is required of it. You can imagine those tiny creatures as your strange, quiet neighbors, demonstrating that even in impossible conditions, life knows how to rest in its own way. Later tonight, if you're still awake, we'll visit other citizens of the dust. For now, we stay close to this single speck, this little floating world. A dust particle is not smooth. Under enough magnification, its surface becomes a jagged city of peaks and hollows. On one edge, a grain of dried salt might cling like a crystal lighthouse. On another, a fragment of soot might sit like dark snow. Each piece remembers something, a cloud it once drifted in a road it passed over, maybe even the simple warmth of your breath. Your day may have been full of things that felt big and blunt. Deadlines, emails, arguments, errands. But here, in a fleck of what most people would call dirt, there are delicate architectures and histories stacked together. You don't have to unpack them. Just knowing they exist lets your mind loosen its grip on the usual problems and wander somewhere smaller, stranger, safer. Somewhere on that dust speck, there might be a tiny droplet forming from the humidity of your breath. At that scale, water behaves differently. Its surface tension turns it into a rounded bead, a miniature planet of liquid clinging to rough terrain. A thin film of water that would evaporate in seconds from your fingertip can be for microbes a whole temporary world. You might feel a quiet comfort in that. The problems that fill your head right now, the ones that feel like oceans, might be from another perspective, just thin films that will evaporate in time. Not because they don't matter, but because everything exists on its own scale. Somewhere unimaginably larger than you. Maybe there are beings who would look at your entire city the way we are looking at a droplet on a dust speck. Interesting, transient, beautiful, but not heavy enough to carry forever. Relaxing science for overthinking minds at night doesn't have to be grand. It can be this, the gentle knowledge that the blanket over you is a landscape, that the air you breathe is an aquarium, that every mote floating through a ray of light is a cargo ship of pollen, minerals, fibers, and living cells. This isn't information you have to store. It's more like a background lullaby, a soft reminder that reality is far more intricate than the to-do list waiting for you tomorrow. If your eyelids are starting to feel heavier, you can let them. You don't have to listen carefully. You don't have to track the story. The words can just become a low, steady weather system moving through your room. Something for your mind to rest against instead of its own worries. And if you drift off in the middle of a sentence, the tiny worlds will keep going without you. Dust will still float. Water bears will still sleep and wake and walk. The universe does not need your constant attention in order to be strange and beautiful. In the next part, if you happen to still be here, we'll shrink down even further, slipping past the surface of the dust itself into the spaces between its atoms where emptiness and solidity are not what they seem. And another quiet layer of impossibility is waiting. If you could follow that dust speck closer than your eyes or any simple lens can manage, you would feel the world begin to loosen around its edges. the familiar idea of solid and empty would start to blur. You, resting in your bed, would remain the same size, the same shape, but your imagination would slip downwards as if riding an invisible elevator from the soft cotton of your pillow into the secret architecture of matter itself. You don't have to picture this perfectly. You can lie there just as you are, one hand under your cheek, or your phone resting beside you, screen slowly dimming. This is still just a sleepy science story for adults who love strange facts, not a test. If your thoughts drift away, you won't miss anything important. In fact, the less you try to focus, the easier it becomes to let this quiet impossibility hold you. At the scale of molecules, that dust speck stops being a rough, grainy rock and becomes a city of shapes. Long chains of atoms twist like ribbons. Rings stack and turn like tiny bracelets. Some parts of the speck are made of carbon from long dead plants, some of silica from ground down stone, some of salts left behind by evaporated sweat or tears. Each molecule has its own pattern of bonds, tiny connections that behave a little like hands holding hands. If you were the size of a small molecule, you could drift through this landscape as if between skyscrapers. The air would feel thicker. Nearby, a molecule of water might roll past, spinning like a clumsy acrobat, one oxygen atom with two smaller hydrogen atoms angled like ears. It would bump into others, bounce stick for a moment, then spin free again. The whole place would hum, not with sound exactly, but with motion, with constant, quiet jostling. You don't have to hold on to every detail. Just knowing that beneath your blanket, in the dust, you can't see, there is a slow, endless dance of connections and separations can be enough. Your day may have been full of people pulling on your attention, asking for answers, decisions, energy. Down here, the only decision a molecule makes is whether to hold on or let go when it collides with another. And even that isn't a choice. It's a gentle obedience to simple rules written into the fabric of nature. Later, if you are still awake, we'll wander into stranger rules where particles refuse to behave like tidy little marbles. For now, we linger in this molecular city where things are still almost familiar. A molecule of perfume from someone you passed on the street earlier might still be here, resting quietly on the dust at the edge of your bed. It carries a memory of that brief encounter, the way a scent can sometimes pull you back into a moment you thought you had forgotten. At an even smaller scale, atoms themselves are mostly space. If an atom were as big as a cathedral, its nucleus would be like a fly hovering in the middle, and its electrons would be ghosts moving in vast, empty aisles. What feels firm beneath your body right now, mattress, floor, wall, is at this deeper level, built from emptiness, arranged into patterns. The world holds you up by arranging its gaps as carefully as its pieces. There's a kind of comfort in that. You might feel full tonight, crowded with thoughts, buzzing with what-ifs. But deep down, physically, you are mostly space. The atoms in your bones are ancient, forged in stars, and yet inside each one, there is far more emptiness than substance. You are not as dense and heavy as your worries make you feel. You are a temporary arrangement of gaps and glimmers, cradled by other temporary arrangements, all of them floating quietly in the dark. Some people like to imagine electrons as tiny planets orbiting a sun-like nucleus. But the truth, as far as we know, is softer and stranger. Electrons exist more like clouds of possibility smeared out over space. They are not here or there until something insists on knowing their location. Until then, they are maybes gently spread. Relaxing weird facts for nighttime minds have a way of turning into metaphors when you are tired. You don't have to force it, but you might notice that some parts of your life feel the same, not fixed, not fully decided, just clouds of possibility waiting for the right moment to become solid. It is okay if you don't know exactly where you are going. Even the smallest pieces of reality spend much of their time as maybes. In quantum physics, particles can behave like waves, overlapping, interfering, canceling, and reinforcing one another. On scales far too small for us to see, matter is less like a pile of bricks and more like overlapping ripples on a pond at night. Imagine standing by a very still lake under a moonless sky. You toss in two pebbles. Where the ripples meet, they sometimes cancel, leaving stillness, and sometimes rise higher than either would alone. Inside the dust speck, every atom is surrounded by such ripples of probability. They cross and mingle in silence, producing in their sum the solid feeling world you can touch. You never notice the ripples directly. You simply feel the outcome, the pillow supporting your head, the phone resting on your palm, the gentle weight of your own body. If this begins to feel too abstract, you can let the specifics soften. You are allowed to let the phrases blur into something simpler. Tiny waves in tiny places, adding up to the familiar quiet around you. A relaxing science story to fall asleep to doesn't ask you to solve equations. It just offers a different kind of bedtime sky, to stare into one made of possibilities instead of stars. If you are half drifting now, that is perfectly fine. You might hear only every third sentence. Your mind might start stitching images together. Water bears floating through cathedral-sized atoms, dust specks shining like galaxies. None of it has to be accurate or complete. Your brain can use these odd pieces as raw material for dreams, building whatever landscape feels most restful. In the next part, if you happen to still be awake, we will ride another gentle elevator, this time sideways into the tiny ecosystems living on a single grain of dust on your skin. Microbes, spores, and invisible forests of life that rise and fall with every breath you take. On the surface of your skin, just beneath the soft brush of the air, there is a continent no one has ever mapped. It stretches from the curve of your wrist to the slope of your cheek, from your scalp to the soles of your feet, pressed lightly against the sheets. To you, it is simply your body, tired from the day. To tiny organisms, hitching a ride on a single dust grain, resting on your arm, it is an entire planet wrapped in warmth and slowly cooling night. You don't have to picture them sharply. You can simply lie back, feeling the weight of your blanket, the way the fabric settles around you, like a low hill of safety. Somewhere on that hill, a dust speck has landed, carrying with it an invisible cargo, bacteria spores, fragments of pollen, maybe even the ghost of a plant fiber from a shirt you no longer own. What looks like nothing is actually a floating forest looking for a place to take root. On that single speck, A bacterium might find itself in a valley between two tiny ridges of mineral. Imagine walking through a canyon so deep that the sky is only a narrow ribbon above you. The walls are rough, glittering with crystals of dried sweat and microscopic oils. The air is thick with molecules of water vapor drifting in slow currents you would experience as wind. For the bacterium, your skin is not just a surface. It is weather, climate, landscape, and atmosphere all at once. Most of the time, your immune system keeps this tiny world in balance without you ever noticing. Cells patrol chemical signals whisper, and you go about your day thinking about emails and bills and texts. Right now, as you lie here listening to weird science facts told in a calm bedtime voice, that internal security dance is still going on. You don't have to help. The microbial passengers are not in general invaders. Many are just passing through like tourists who will stay for a few hours on the damp warmth of your skin before drying out and drifting away. Some are long-term residents, adapted specifically to your personal climate, the moisture of your palms, the oil of your forehead, the shadowed stillness behind your ears. If we could listen at their scale, we might hear the slow, quiet sound of division and growth. One cell becoming two, two becoming four. An invisible suburb expanding on the side of a dust grain. You are allowed to feel a little strange about that and then let it go. It's normal to forget that you are not a single thing, but a shared address, a cooperative of countless tiny lives living on and inside you. When you feel lonely at night, when the room feels too quiet, it can be oddly comforting to remember that your body is hosting an entire microscopic city that trusts you enough to sink into rest when you do. On that dust speck, there may be spores from tiny fungi. Under the right conditions, just enough moisture, just the right temperature, they might begin to send out delicate threads, hyphae creeping along the surface like roots seeking soil. Most of the time, conditions are not quite right, and the spores simply wait dormant for a better moment. Patience is their only job. There is a quiet lesson in that waiting. You may be carrying hopes and plans that feel stuck like seeds you planted in ground that never seem to soften. The spores on the dust speck do not blame themselves when nothing happens. They simply exist in potential, ready for the day when warmth and water arrive together. It is okay if some parts of your life are in that same state, present, paused, not yet unfolding. You are not late. For now, we stay with this drifting forest on your skin. Among the microbes, there may be tiny algae or cyanobacteria, descendants of organisms that first learned to harvest light in ancient oceans. When you go outside in daylight and the sun touches your face, some of those will quietly drink the light, turning it into energy in ways that echo the earliest mornings on Earth. Think about that as loosely as you like. You don't need to build a clear mental picture. Just know that you are carrying pieces of the planet's oldest stories on your skin as you lie here in the dark. The same chemical tricks that turned sunlight into food billions of years ago are still happening quietly all over the world on people who have forgotten that they are walking habitats. All of this is happening at a pace that suits your breathing. Cells divide slowly. Spores wait for days, months, years, and your breath slides in and out over them, a much faster tide. If you feel like slowing that tide a little, you can letting each exhale lengthen by just a heartbeat. But you don't have to. Your body has its own wisdom about what rhythm feels safe. This is bedtime science for deep sleep, not instructions or homework. You can allow your thoughts to wander off somewhere else entirely, back to a memory from childhood, forward to a gentle dream, sideways into some impossible image of water bears riding dust grains through sunbeams. The story will keep moving without you needing to steer it, like a river carrying a small boat whose passenger has fallen asleep. The next time you see a beam of light in a dark room, perhaps from a curtain that didn't quite close, or a street lamp sneaking past your blinds, you might notice the dust drifting through it. Instead of thinking of it as dirt, you might remember that it is a cloud of tiny habitats of invisible forests and waiting seeds and patient cells, not something to fear or obsess over. Just another reminder that the universe loves to hide complexity inside what looks like nothing. In the next part, if your eyes are still open, we'll leave the world of living passengers and follow the dust speck itself through the air, watching how the simple physics of turbulence and currents can turn a tiny grain into a long traveler, wandering rooms, streets, and even entire cities without ever meaning to go anywhere at all. The dust speck on your skin does not stay there forever, even in a room that feels still, where the curtains hardly move, and the air seems heavy with late-night quiet. The tiny grain is riding invisible currents. Your chest rises and falls. Your blanket shifts by a centimeter. Somewhere, a refrigerator hums on and off. Each small motion sends ripples through the air, soft waves that turn your room into a slow, unseen ocean. You don't have to move to imagine it. You can remain exactly as you are your body, a calm island in the dark. The dust lifts a fraction of a millimeter, then settles, then lifts again, caught in the gentle breeze of your own breathing. To you, it is nothing. To the speck, these tiny pushes and pulls are like winds and storms that decide whether it clings to your arm or drifts away toward the ceiling. Air at our scale feels like emptiness. You sweep your hand through it and feel almost nothing. But at the scale of a dust speck, air is thick, crowded with molecules crashing into one another like bumper cars moving far too fast to see. The speck never really rests. Even when the room is quiet, molecules slam into its surface, unevenly jostling it in random directions. This jittery dance has a name: Brownian motion. You can think of it as a kind of cosmic fidgeting. The dust grain cannot stop being knocked around by the thermal chaos of the air. It doesn't have a destination. It isn't trying to go anywhere. It just responds moment by tiny moment to the thousands of microscopic taps it receives from all sides. Sometimes those taps almost cancel, and it drifts lazily. Sometimes a chance cluster of collisions nudges it upward, and for a second it floats. There's something oddly gentle about that. In your own life, you might feel pressure to have a clear direction, a plan, a map for the next year, the next decade. The dust speck has none of that. It is carried. It yields. It lets the invisible weather of its environment decide where it will rest next. For tonight, you are allowed to borrow a little of that permission to be moved without figuring everything out. When you open a door, During the day, stronger currents rush through your home. Warm air rises. Cooler air sinks. Even now, as the night settles, there are temperature differences between your window and your wall, between the floor and the ceiling. These gradients create tiny convection cells, loops of air that climb, curl, and fall like slow, transparent lava lamps. Dust grains get caught in these loops and can spend hours, even days, simply circling. If you've ever noticed a beam of sunlight full of motes that seem to hover in place, you are witnessing this slow choreography. Those specks are not frozen. They are surfing currents you cannot see, looping, sinking, rising. The room may look still, but it is not. Nothing truly is. Even in this quiet hour, with your phone dim and your eyes heavy, the air around you is alive with subtle motion. Relaxing science for overthinking minds at night can be as simple as this: remembering that there is a whole soft physics unfolding around you that asks nothing in return. The equations stay hidden. What reaches you is only the image, a tiny traveler drifting from your pillow to your bedside table, from there to the bookshelf, then upward toward the ceiling where warm air gathers. Sometimes a dust grain meets a stronger flow, a draft from an open window, the wake of someone walking by, the rising plume from a candle just blown out. It can be carried meters, even kilometers in this way, especially outdoors. A car passes on a street far below an apartment balcony. The disturbed air spirals upward, lifting bits of soil pollen, and yes, the occasional fragment of skin or fabric. Each one becomes an unwilling passenger on an atmospheric escalator. You might have shed such specks all day without noticing at your desk, in a store, on public transport. Some of them may travel far beyond the places you ever visit, joining urban dust that coats rooftops and windowsills, or settling eventually into cracks in the pavement where tiny plants will later take root. For a while, every step you took, every door you opened, was part of their story. It can be strangely comforting to realize that not everything in your life must be deliberate to be meaningful. The dust speck does not know where it has come from or where it is going, and yet its journey links places, objects, and moments. A grain that once rested on your favorite book might someday be brushed off a stranger's shoe miles away. No one will notice, but the connection exists, quiet and real. Brownian motion convection. Currents, drafts, and eddies, these are not dramatic forces. They are soft, persistent shapers of tiny worlds. In your own thoughts, there are versions of these currents, too small, influences half-remembered conversations, the mood of the weather, a song that got stuck in your head. They nudge you without asking for permission. You are not failing when you feel drifty or unfocused. You are just human, suspended in the invisible air of your circumstances. If you notice your attention wandering now, that is perfectly all right. The story can become a background murmur, like distant traffic or rain on a window. You do not have to latch onto every sentence. Your brain can let these images of motes and currents wash over it, choosing only the pieces that feel soft enough to keep letting the rest evaporate into the night. Later, if you are somehow still awake, we will follow a dust grain even higher into the cold, slow layers of the atmosphere, where tiny particles become seeds for clouds. For now, we stay closer to your room, where the journey is gentle and small. A speck lifts off your blanket, floats a few centimeters, and settles onto the flat surface of your nightstand, coming to rest beside your phone. On that smooth surface, in the thin layer of air just above it, another tiny world begins. In the next part, if your mind is still drifting along with me, we'll slip inside that resting dust speck again. But this time, as it becomes the heart of something new, a minuscule droplet forming around it, the beginning of a cloud in a glass of water, or a misty breath rising into cooler air. When warm breath meets cooler air, something quiet happens around every tiny particle floating there. You exhale, maybe without thinking about it, a soft sigh into the dark room. The air leaving your lungs carries heat and moisture, invisible as it passes your lips. But the moment it brushes against colder currents near your window, or the faint chill above your nightstand, that invisible vapor begins to gather. And it prefers not to gather alone. It looks for anchors, for starting points. It looks for dust. You can stay exactly as you are. Body-heavy eyelids, maybe a little tired, phone screen dim beside you. You don't have to change your breathing. Just let it move on its own. Somewhere in that slow rhythm, one of your breaths curls upward and drifts over the resting dust speck on the table. Molecules of water bump into it, cling, slide away, then cling again. Eventually, enough of them stay that a tiny rounded bead begins to form a minuscule droplet, wrapping itself around the grain like a coat of glass. At this scale, water is clingy. Surface tension pulls it tight, smoothing its edges, making it as spherical as the situation allows. The dust speck becomes a hidden heart, a condensation nucleus, a solid seed that gives shape to something soft. Without particles like this, vapor would find it much harder to turn into drops. Clouds in the sky, fog on a hillside, mist from your breath. When you step into cold air, all of them lean on dust and pollen smoke and salt tiny anchors around which water can gather. You don't need to remember the term condensation nucleus. It can float away as soon as you hear it. What matters is the feeling of it, a piece of almost nothing, becoming the center of something visible. A speck that would pass unnoticed in a sunbeam suddenly matters very much to the droplet that forms around it. Under the right light, that bead might catch a glow, turn into a little shining pearl on the smooth surface of your table. If you were small enough, you could stand on the dust grain and look out through the water around you, as if through the curved wall of a tiny aquarium. The outside world would be distorted lines bending and stretching, bright points shattering into soft halos. A single LED on your charger might appear as a blooming star, smeared into a green or blue streak by the curve of the droplet. Each shift of your breathing would make the view wobble gently, like waves in a glassy sea. Later tonight, if you're somehow still drifting here with me, we'll look at light more closely, at the way it scatters and bends in these small worlds. For now, we stay with the droplet itself. Its surface is a border that feels sharp in equations, but in reality is fuzzy, made of layers of molecules making up their minds about which side they belong on. Some slip free into vapor again. Some arrive from the air and settle, deepening the curve. It is not a fixed shape. It is a negotiation in progress. Inside, the droplet dissolved. Gases move quietly. A few molecules of oxygen from the room. A bit of carbon dioxide from your breath, trace amounts of other things the air has picked up during the day. If any microbes hitched a ride on the dust speck, they suddenly find themselves underwater in a world of different resistance and buoyancy. For some, this is a brief disaster. For others, an opportunity. Life has a habit of treating chance combinations as invitations. You might recall mornings when your bathroom mirror fogged up after a hot shower, the glass turning hazy and then slowly beading with droplets. Each of those tiny beads had a story like this: one, warm, wet air relaxing against a cooler surface vapor, choosing to settle and stay. The fog on the mirror wasn't a flaw. It was a reminder that temperature and moisture are always quietly negotiating with each other, turning invisible processes into something you can see. In your glass of cold water, on a humid day, droplets form on the outside, tiny pearls running together and sliding down. Again, dust plays its silent role, giving structure to the gathering. The outside of the glass becomes a little cloud wall. Moisture that was drifting freely in the room finds itself suddenly arranged into visible form, all because it met a cooler surface and a few willing specks. Relaxing science to fall asleep doesn't have to be grand or cosmic. It can live right here, in the way your iced drink sweats, the way your breath briefly draws ghost words on a winter window, the way a misty morning seems to wrap the world in cotton. Behind each of those scenes, there are countless dust specks and droplets meeting, parting, forming, falling. You're surrounded by quiet alchemy that asks nothing from you but a passing glance. If some part of you feels small and unimportant tonight, swallowed by responsibilities or worries that seem huge and formless, you might let this image sit with you. Even a nearly invisible dust grain can become the center of a tiny universe of water and light. It doesn't become important by trying. It simply exists where it is, and conditions around it decide that it is time for something to gather. You don't have to do anything dramatic to matter. Sometimes simply being where you are with your particular history, your particular mixture of flaws and strengths, is enough for ripples to form around you. A kind word you barely remember saying might have been a condensation nucleus for someone else's healing. A small decision you made years ago might still be shaping drop by drop the way your life curves today. If this feels too big for this hour, you can let it fade and return to the simpler picture. A dust speck on a table, a tiny droplet forming around it from the moisture of your breath. Its surface catches a stray bit of light, glows for a moment. Then, as the room's currents change, the bead thins, flattens, and finally vanishes back into the air. In the next part, if your eyes are somehow still open, we'll follow light itself through these tiny worlds, watching how a dust speck and its droplet become a lens, a prism, and a quiet painter of tiny glows in the space around your sleeping body. Light is already touching your room, even if your curtains are closed, and the only glow comes from your screen. It spills softly from tiny sources, a standby LED, a street lamp sneaking in around the edges of the blinds, a faint reflection from a distant window. Most of the time, you see it as simple brightness. But to the dust speck, wrapped in its little droplet on your nightstand, that light arrives as a storm of tiny, weightless messengers. You don't have to picture photons as particles or waves or equations. Tonight, they can simply be gentle visitors arriving from far away to brush past tiny worlds. A beam from your phone's dim display spreads into the room, its light thinning as it travels. When it hits the water shell around the dust speck, a few of those visitors slow bend and change direction, as if they were politely stepping aside to walk around a curve in a hallway. Water, even in a droplet too small for you to see, acts like a lens. It bends the path of light, passing through it, squeezing beams together, or spreading them out, depending on the shape of the surface. If you were tiny enough to stand on the dust grain at the center, the world outside would look warped through the curved wall of your droplet. Straight lines would become soft arcs. A simple dot of light would smear into a ring or stretch into a small glowing tear. On mornings when you've noticed dew beating on a spiderweb or a car windshield, you were seeing a whole field of lenses at once. Each droplet caught a bit of the rising sun and bent it, turning the web or the glass into a grid of tiny stars. The same thing happens on your nightstand now, just on a scale too small for your eyes. Microscopic beads scattered across the surface take the faint light in your room and quietly rework it, creating miniature flares and halos that no one ever sees. Relaxing science for overthinking minds at night can be as gentle as remembering this: every source of light you see is throwing out countless tiny travelers, and almost all of them pass by unnoticed. Some, though, run into dust droplets, tiny scratches in the surface of your table. They bounce, scatter, combine. The brightness and shadow that your tired eyes register as this room are built from millions of these interactions layered together until they feel like one continuous glow. In clean air, light travels in mostly straight lines. But when the air is full of particles, as in fog smoke or a dusty attic beam, those particles scatter light in all directions. This scattering is why the sky is blue in the daytime. Molecules in the atmosphere nudge shorter, bluer wavelengths of sunlight around more strongly than reds and oranges, spreading blue across the vault of the sky. At sunrise and sunset, when the sunlight travels a longer path through air, much of the blue has been scattered away, leaving warmer colors to reach your eyes. You don't have to hold on to the details. The simple image is enough. Light meets stuff, and color appears. On some distant afternoon, someone half a world away might step outside and see a pale ring around the sun, an ice halo painted by crystals high in the sky. Each crystal is just another tiny lens, like the droplet on your nightstand, bending light into something human minds read as a sign, a symbol, a moment of beauty. Inside your room, the dust speck's droplet may be splitting tiny fragments of white light into soft rainbows you'll never know about. Even a trace of color is enough to make the microscopic world shimmer. If your phone screen has a hint of blue, that blue becomes a slightly different blue when it passes through or around the droplet, filtered and softened by its curvature. At this hour, the world is editing its own light without asking you to notice. Sometimes, light doesn't just bend, it interferes with itself. When two waves of light overlap, they can either amplify or cancel one another, making spots brighter or darker. The shimmering color you see on a soap bubble or an oil slick on wet pavement comes from this interference. Different wavelengths line up differently, so some colors become stronger, while others fade depending on the thickness of the film. If you could blow a bubble as small as your dust droplet and hold it above your nightstand, its surface would produce the same quiet magic. Bands of color would drift and change as the film thinned under gravity, as tiny currents pulled the liquid around. To any microbe clinging to that surface, the changing light would be a kind of weather, a slow aurora swirling across its sky. You might never see these effects in your room tonight. That's all right. You don't have to see a phenomenon for it to exist. Reality goes on performing its light tricks, whether or not anyone is watching. You are allowed for once to be the one who simply lies down and lets the world do the work. The droplets and dust will bend and scatter photons without requesting your attention or approval. If your eyes are starting to blur, if the edges of the room feel softer, you can let that happen. You don't need to stay sharply aware. A relaxing science story to fall asleep to is meant to become vague at the edges, like a painting your mind is slowly stepping away from. The less tightly you focus, the more the colors blend into something quiet and whole. Somewhere in this gentle blur, tiny lenses keep shaping light. Tiny grains keep catching it. They will continue long after this sentence ends, long after your thoughts have drifted elsewhere. And if this sleepy journey ever chooses to unfold again, beyond this point, that future step will simply be the seventh small layer in our descent through these hidden miniature worlds. This seventh small layer of our tiny world journey doesn't move outward or inward as much as it moves in another direction, entirely through time. You are still lying where you were a moment ago, maybe a little heavier, maybe a little closer to sleep. The room hasn't changed. The phone is still near your hand. But the dust speck we've been visiting is not just a place in space. It is also a knot in a long, quiet thread of history. On its surface, there are patches of things that arrived minutes ago, carried by your breath and the currents of this evening. Beneath those fused and mixed are fragments that came days or weeks earlier, a flake of skin from someone's wrist, a grain of soot that drifted in through a window, a crumb of soil shaken from a shoe. Deeper still, at the level of molecules and atoms, lie pieces of stories so old that human memory simply cannot hold them. You don't have to sort any of it. You have sorted enough today: messages, tasks, decisions, worries. Here, you can let the layers pile up without your intervention. Dust is patient. It never asks you to prioritize. It simply receives whatever the air brings. Some of the carbon atoms in that speck once belonged to a leaf on a tree, drinking sunlight and exhaling oxygen into the sky. Before that, they might have been floating as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, or locked in the shell of a tiny marine creature, sinking slowly to the ocean floor. Trace them back far enough, and every heavy element in that dust, carbon, oxygen, silicon, iron was forged in the heart of stars that lived and died long before the Earth was born. It is strange and gentle to think that a relaxing science story to fall asleep to can be hiding in something as ordinary as what collects on a bookshelf. The speck on your nightstand is a little museum of stardust and leaf dust and city dust, all pressed together into one almost invisible grain. Your fingertips have probably brushed away thousands of such museums without ever knowing. Scientists sometimes read history from dust in much the same way that someone might read a diary. In the deep ice of Antarctica or Greenland, each year's snowfall traps particles from the air, ash from distant volcanoes, soot from fires, pollution from human industry. When the snow compacts into ice, those layers stay thin and fragile, but readable. By drilling down and bringing up cores, researchers can see spikes of sulfur or lead traces of ancient eruptions and coal smoke, like faint pencil marks left by past centuries. You do not need to remember those details. They can be as soft as background music. What matters is the feeling that the world leaves gentle fingerprints of its past in places no one thinks to look. Your day has left its fingerprints too, in your muscles, in your mood, in the small pile of objects near your bed. But not every trace has to be examined before you sleep. Some can simply settle like dust on a quiet shelf. Even the air in your room carries time. If there is a wooden piece of furniture nearby, a table or a chair, molecules are slowly drifting off its surface, tiny ghosts of the tree it once was. They mix with older molecules from paint, fabric, plastic. When they eventually land on the dust speck, they join that silent record without fanfare. No one applauds. No one writes down the moment. And yet the layer is there. On longer scales, dust becomes part of rock. In abandoned buildings, layers of it accumulate undisturbed for years. In caves, fine particles settle out of slow-moving air and are later cemented into stone. On the sea floor, microscopic shells and dust rains down in a continuous drizzle, forming sediments that over millions of years compress into shale and limestone. Inside those rocks, tiny grains from long-forgotten rooms and landscapes are locked away, waiting for some distant future when erosion or a curious geologist will set them free again. You might feel that your own days blur together, sometimes like a stack of translucent pages where none seems dramatic enough to stand out. That can feel discouraging when you are awake scrolling and comparing and measuring your life against noisier stories. But on a quieter level, you are also laying down layers of experience, of small kindnesses, of quiet endurance. Most will never become headlines, and that is all right. Dust levels do not shout, but over time, they can reshape a room, a building, a landscape. If your mind wants to use this as metaphor, it can. If it does not, if it is too tired, even for that, you can let the comparison slide away. It is enough to know that tiny things repeated gently over time become something sturdy. The habit of lying down and letting your thoughts soften at the end of the day is one of those things. Each night, you make space for rest. You add one more thin, nearly invisible layer of care to yourself. Right now, the layer you are adding is very simple. You, listening to soft, strange facts in the dark, allowing your attention to be held by something that doesn't demand a response. Dust is settling somewhere as you do this, choosing new resting places on picture frames and corners inside the quiet creases of books. The world keeps archiving itself in the background while you do nothing but lie still. If your eyelids are heavy, you can let them close or half close. The story does not need your full sharp focus. It is designed to keep walking, even if you drift behind it, like a friend talking beside you on a long, slow walk at night, unconcerned if you miss every other sentence. The tiny museums will continue to expand without supervision. And if this gentle descent happens to go on beyond these sentences, the next place it wanders will be an 8th small layer 1 that follows a single atom in the dust speck even farther back into the inside of a star where its long journey first began. Pick one atom from the dust speck on your nightstand, just one among the countless that make up its rough little body, and imagine it as a faint point of light in your mind. Maybe it is a carbon atom, the kind that likes to hold hands with others, building chains and rings and lattices. Tonight, we will let that single atom tell its story. A story that began long before your room, your city, or even the earth itself existed. You can stay exactly as you are while we trace it back. Your pillow under your head, fabric against your skin, the familiar weight of your own body sinking into the mattress. Nothing outside needs to change for us to move inward and backward at the same time. Your eyes can be open or closed, your attention sharp or fuzzy. This is not a demanding journey. It's more like listening to distant thunder, soft and low, knowing the storm is far away and will not touch you. In the early universe, there was no carbon at all. Space was filled mostly with hydrogen and a little helium, a vast thin fog slowly gathering itself into clumps under the pull of gravity. One of those clumps became a star. As the gas fell inward, it heated its core, growing dense and hot enough for hydrogen nuclei to fuse, joining together and releasing light. Inside that furnace, hydrogen was pressed into helium, and in later stages, some of that helium and other light nuclei combined into heavier elements, carbon, oxygen, and beyond. The atom we are following might have been born in one of those close embraces when 3 helium nuclei briefly came together in the crushing heat, and instead of flying apart again, settled into a new, more complex whole. Eventually, the star that made this carbon atom could no longer hold itself together in the same way. Stars change as they age. Their cores fill with ash from previous fusion. Their balance between gravity, pulling in, and pressure, pushing out, becomes delicate. Some swell into red giants, their outer layers puffing up and cooling, becoming soft, luminous shells. Others end in more dramatic releases, scattering newly forged elements into space. If the atom we're following came from such a release, it may have spent ages drifting in interstellar space, frozen quiet, part of a thin gas between stars. Out there, darkness is not empty. It is just very spacious. Atoms wander like lonely travelers between distant towns, bumping occasionally into one another, forming molecules that may last for a while and then break apart again. Time stretches. Millions of years pass the way minutes pass for us. There is a kind of comfort in thinking about that slow wandering. If you have felt rootless at times in your own life, uncertain where you belong, this atom knows something about that. It spent longer than any human lifespan simply floating, waiting for the next gravity well, the next pull. It did not fail in that waiting. It was simply in transit. At some later point in its journey, this carbon atom found itself pulled into a new forming star system, into a cloud of dust and gas swirling around a young sun. Within that disk, grains stuck together, colliding gently, then more firmly, becoming pebbles, rocks, and eventually small world seeds. Pieces merged and separated, sometimes shattering, sometimes combining. Our atom might have been part of a primitive mineral in such a grain, one tiny participant in the construction of a new planet. If that new planet was the one you are lying on now, then the atom's path eventually led it into Earth's crust, ocean's air, or living things. It may have been taken up by a plant woven into a leaf, then eaten by an animal, becoming part of muscle or bone for a time. It might have traveled through many bodies this way, joining and leaving, participating in the slow choreography of life and decay, before ending up in the fragment of material that became the dust speck on your nightstand. You don't have to hold the entire chain clearly. It's more like a lullaby about movement from star to space to rock to life to dust. The point is not to memorize the route, but to feel how long and strangely patient the universe has been with tiny things. The atom you're imagining has already been inside furnaces hotter than anything on Earth, frozen in deep space, folded into leaves and bones. Now, it's resting in your room, a quiet guest in a quiet hour. Sometimes, people say that we are made of stardust, and as far as we know, that's simply true. The iron in your blood, the calcium in your bones, the carbon in your skin, and in the dust around you. All of it was assembled in stars and scattered, mixed, reused. It can just be a soft fact, a reminder that you come from a very old story, older than any deadline or worry flickering through your mind tonight. If you feel exhausted from trying to burn bright all the time, from being productive and efficient and useful, you might let yourself borrow another image from stars. They do not shine at the same intensity forever. They have phases. They swell, dim, shed layers, rest in new forms. Their gift to the universe is not constant performance, but periodic release of light, of matter, of the heavy elements that will become something else. You are allowed quieter phases, softer nights like this one. Our carbon atom is not done. It will not stay in this dust speck forever. Someday the speck will be cleaned away, washed, swept, or carried out a window. The atom will rejoin air, soil, water, or another living body. It will keep circulating long after both of us have forgotten this story. As your thoughts drift, you might imagine very vaguely that the worries circling in your head are a bit like that too. Temporary configurations of something more basic, patterns that will eventually dissolve and rearrange. They feel solid now, but they are not the deepest truth about you. At a simpler level, you are made of atoms that have already survived the lives and deaths of stars. Lying here, letting your muscles soften and your breath slow, you are not falling behind. You are aligning for a while with the slower rhythm of the matter you're built from. If this sleepy trail ever chooses to keep winding forward from here, its next curve will be a ninth tiny layer, one that turns from ancient atoms toward the even smaller sparks inside your own resting brain, where thoughts and dreams flutter in their own quiet microcosm, somewhere inside your skull. At this very moment, tiny storms of electricity are moving more slowly than they did a few hours ago. You are lying there, maybe on your side, maybe on your back, feeling the shape of your own head against the pillow. Beneath bone and skin and the quiet weight of the day, billions of neurons are changing the way they talk to each other, shifting from the sharp chatter of daytime into something softer, more like waves rolling onto a dark shore. You don't have to feel any of this directly. Your job is still wonderfully simple. Stay where you are. Let the covers hold you. Allow your thoughts to blur at the edges. This is just another tiny world to drift through a private universe of cells and signals, where a relaxing science story to fall asleep to is also, in a small way, a story about you. A single neuron is not very impressive to look at, even under a microscope. It's a cell with branches, a central body, thin dendrites reaching like twigs, and one long axon that can stretch much farther than you would expect, like a cable running through soft, living ground. Each neuron listens to thousands of others at the same time, tiny pulses arriving across its surface. When enough of those pulses line up, it sends out its own signal, a brief electrical spike that races down the axon at a speed ranging from a slow walk to a quick sprint. That spike is called an action potential, but you don't need the term. You can think of it as a tiny, yes, a moment when the neuron says, "I have heard enough. It's my turn to speak," and passes the message along. In the bright hours of the day, vast networks of these tiny yeses allow you to read, type, decide, worry, plan. At night, as you lie here listening to soft, slow science narration to help you fall asleep, many of those networks gently loosen their grip. Between neurons, there are synapses, narrow gaps, across which chemicals carry signals. When an electrical pulse reaches the end of a neuron, little packets of molecules are released into that gap. They drift a tiny distance, then bind to receptors on the neighboring cell. Some of those signals say, "Be more likely to fire," and some say, "Be more quiet." Your brain, at any instant, is the sum of all those microscopic invitations and refusals. It might sound busy, and it is, but as sleep approaches, the pattern of that busyness changes. During deep sleep, large groups of neurons begin to fire together in slow, rhythmic waves, like a crowd breathing in unison. On an EEG, those waves appear as high rolling curves instead of jagged peaks. Inside your head, it is as if the city of cells has dimmed its streetlights and agreed to move in the same slow tempo for a while. You do not have to force that shift. You cannot schedule it by sheer willpower. What you can do is offer the system gentler inputs, dim light, less noise, steady breathing, and a stream of calm, low-demand images like the ones we have been walking through tonight. Scientific oddities for deep sleep work partly because they give your thinking mind something interesting, but not urgent to hold, while the deeper layers of your brain quietly change mode. Hidden among these cells are oddities as strange as any water bear or dust grain. There are neurons in your visual cortex that respond strongly to edges tilted at just the right angle, as if their entire preference in life were a slanted line. There are cells that care about movement in only one direction, others that tune in to specific frequencies of sound. Somewhere in your temporal lobe, clusters of neurons respond when you hear your own name even faintly through noise. Tiny variations in chemistry matter here too. Molecules like adenosine build up in your brain while you are awake. As they accumulate, they gently nudge networks towards sleepiness, whispering that it might be time to rest. Caffeine works by sitting in some of the same seats those molecules would use, blocking the whisper. By this hour of the night, much of the caffeine, if you had any, has begun to step aside. The original message, "You are tired," returns. You don't need to visualize receptors or molecules. Just knowing that your sleepiness is not a personal failing, but a quiet, well-organized chemical suggestion can be a relief. Your body is not betraying you when your thoughts slow or your eyelids feel heavy. It is following a rhythm written in pulses and gradients in the gentle swing between waking networks and sleeping waves. As you drift, your brain begins to produce spindles, brief bursts of faster activity that ride on top of slower waves. These may help protect your sleep from sudden noises wrapping you in a kind of sensory blanket. They flare up when a sound reaches your ears, helping decide whether it deserves to wake you or can be folded into a dream instead. Most of the little creaks and distant cars and hallway footsteps never make it fully into your awareness. They are caught and softened by this quiet machinery. It can be comforting to imagine that even as you let go of control, something inside is still watching over you, choosing gently on your behalf. You don't have to monitor every noise or think through every possibility. Parts of your brain that do not tire in the same way stay awake enough to keep you safe so that the rest can finally rest. If your thoughts are starting to slip their shape, to turn into half scenes and almost dreams, you can let them. The exact boundary between wakefulness and sleep is blurry, like the edge of a small cloud lit by a setting sun. One moment, you are following each word. The next, the story and your own images have woven together into something private and strange. That is not a mistake. That is the doorway doing its work. Scientific oddities can live here too in this threshold. A burst of random activity in the visual cortex might become the first flicker of a dream landscape. A stray memory from your day, a stranger's coat, a message you read, a line from a song might combine with the image of a dust speck or a tardigrade from earlier parts of this journey. Your brain is a restless storyteller even when you ask it to slow down. Tonight, though, its stories don't have to be sharp. They can be soft, unresolved, more like moving paintings than puzzles to solve. If this quiet wandering decides to keep going after these lines, the next bend will be a 10th layer, turning our attention back outward again, from the storms inside your head to the wider, tiny worlds that rest on and around the room where you sleep. Around you, machines are dreaming their own tiny, precise dreams. Your room, which feels so still and simple from where you lie, is filled with silent, engineered worlds working at scales you rarely think about. On your nightstand, your phone rests like a dark, quiet stone. But inside it, countless electrons are still slipping through pathways thinner than a strand of your hair, guided by patterns etched into crystals of silicon. You do not have to do anything about that. The screen can be dim or off, your hand can be resting or empty. The phone, the charger, the lamp, even the clock on the wall, each of them carries miniature architectures built from the same atoms we followed earlier, shaped into circuits and components that behave in oddly reliable ways. While you release your grip on the day, these tiny systems go on pulsing and ticking with unbothered regularity. Inside the phone, a small slice of silicon acts as a home for transistors, the microscopic switches that form its thinking and remembering. Each transistor is like a gate that can be either open or closed, allowing or blocking the flow of electrons. On your device, there are billions of them, arranged in intricate patterns that carry instructions, images, messages, and sound. When you scroll before bed, those patterns flicker at unimaginable speed. Now, as the phone rests, many of those gates are quiet, yet their potential remains a sleeping city of switches waiting for the next tiny surge. Somewhere in your device, a crystal keeps time. It might be a sliver of quartz cut, so that when a small voltage passes through it, it vibrates at a very stable frequency. Electronics count those vibrations, dividing and dividing until they get the heartbeat needed to measure seconds and minutes. When you glanced at the time before lying down, you were reading the rhythm of that invisible shard. You don't need to imagine the exact shape of the crystal. You can simply know that even if the rest of the phone is quiet, some part of it hums in a way too small for you to feel marking time in microscopic steps. Your own body has its rhythms, heartbeat, breathing brainwaves, and beside you, a tiny stone built from Earth's minerals keeps its own much faster beat. Two clocks, one made of cells and one of crystal, resting within arm's reach. Elsewhere in the room, more hidden worlds keep their small duties. Inside your lamp, if it has an LED bulb, there are chips where electrons move through layers of material that emit light when they are nudged just right. Each tiny junction is like a doorway where an electron falls from a higher step to a lower one, giving off a packet of light as it does. Millions of those little falls are what you see from far away as a single, steady glow. Even when the lamp is off, its parts are waiting, their structures unchanged, ready for the next flow of current. Copper wires curl within the walls, running behind paint and plaster, forming paths for energy that is not currently moving, but could move with a small decision. Your room is full of potential motion held in place. Springs in pens, tension in hinges, charges balanced in materials. You are surrounded by readiness, even as you lie here, with permission to do absolutely nothing. Relaxing science for overthinking minds at night can include these manufactured oddities as well as the natural ones. There is something quietly reassuring about knowing that inside the objects you use every day, there are reliable tricks of materials doing their job without needing praise, without asking you to supervise. The ceramic in a capacitor silently holds and releases electric charge. Thin metallic traces on a circuit board carry signals along predetermined roads. The small magnet in a speaker waits to tug on coils and move air when sound is needed and rests when it is not. If you have a digital clock glowing softly somewhere in the room, its numbers change with a smooth, unhurried certainty. Behind those digits are counters and dividers, tiny electronic pulses stepping along like footsteps in an invisible hallway. All day, those pulses accumulate. All night, as you sleep, they continue. The clock does not get bored. It does not worry about its purpose. It just counts following rules etched into its wiring. You might spend your days navigating complexity that feels far less stable. Shifting expectations, uncertain plans, emotional ups and downs. It can be grounding to remember that some parts of your world are built on routines so simple that they rarely falter. A transistor does not wake up anxious about tomorrow. A quartz crystal does not question whether it deserves to vibrate. They simply perform their tiny roles moment after moment. If this thought feels comforting, you can lean into it. If it feels like too much to hold, you can let it dissolve, and return to the more immediate feeling of pillow blanket and the gentle weight of your own limbs. The story can keep strolling along the circuitry without needing you to follow each turn. It is enough for you to know that as you drift, there are little engines of precision nearby, keeping time and holding information so that your mind is free to slacken. As your thoughts grow slower, you might picture the room not as a collection of tasks waiting for you in the morning, emails on the phone, alarms on the clock, books on the table, but as a cluster of tiny, well-behaved universes around you. Circuits, crystals, magnets, wires, all built from atoms that once burned in stars, now domesticated into tools that will still be here when you wake up. If there is more of this wandering left to unfold, it will eventually turn toward an 11th layer where all these tiny worlds, the dust, the droplets, the microbes, the circuits, and the sleeping networks in your own brain are seen together as small islands floating in the larger, slow-moving sea of the planet that carries you. Far beneath your room, under the building, under the streets and roots and pipes, the planet is turning. You are lying still, but the ground beneath you is moving with a slow, steady confidence, carrying you through space on a sphere wrapped in layer after layer of tiny worlds. All the dust specks we visited tonight, all the droplets and microbes and circuits are passengers on this larger body, sharing a ride they did not choose but quietly depend on. You don't have to feel that motion. To you, the bed is solid, the room unmoving. That sense of stability is a kind of kindness your inner senses offer you so that you can rest without constantly noticing the grander drift. But whether you are aware of it or not, the earth is turning you toward a new morning, even as your body sinks deeper into the softness of this night. If we could strip away walls and ceilings for a moment in imagination, keeping you safely untouched in your blanket, we would see the other tiny worlds sharing this slice of the planet. In the soil, outside under grass or concrete, countless microorganisms are slowly eating, breathing, dividing, turning fallen leaves and old roots into new nutrients. Each teaspoon of that soil might hold more individual lives than there are humans on the planet, most of them never seen, never named. In the oceans, waves that you cannot hear from your room are moving through vast fields of plankton, drifting organisms, many of them single cells that float near the surface. These tiny glassy-bodied plants and microbes quietly inhale carbon dioxide and exhale oxygen, helping refill the air you are breathing right now. Night and day, in storm and calm, they continue their patient work, unaware of the cities sleeping on the continents above. High overhead clouds drift on cool layers of air, carrying droplets organized around dust specks, a little like the one on your nightstand. Some of that dust came from deserts, some from sea spray, some from distant fires. Particles rise, travel, fall, and rise again, making the atmosphere a shared story, space for lands that will never meet. Somewhere rain is forming, each drop a tiny collaboration between gravity water and microscopic anchors. You don't have to hold the whole planet in your mind. It would be too much, especially now when you are tired. It is enough to know that you are resting inside a network of small, ongoing processes that do not depend on your focus or effort. While you sleep, soil will still breathe, clouds will still shift, plankton will still turn light into life. You are allowed to opt out for a few hours. In forests far from where you lie, there are nights when fog gathers under the trees and hangs there beating on pine needles and spider webs. Each droplet that forms is another tiny lens, bending moonlight or starlight into quiet glimmers. Beneath the fog roots are exchanging signals, chemical messages moving between fungi and trees, sharing resources in ways that resemble conversation more than competition. The forest does not shut down when the sun sets. It just changes its tempo. Cities have their own night rhythms. Traffic thins, lights dim in some windows and flare in others. On rooftops and windowsills, dust accumulates in thin films, holding fragments of rubber metal, pollen skin. Tiny plants take root in cracks. Mosses, lichens, stubborn weeds, turning unremarkable ledges into ecosystems. Above them, moths and bats trace invisible paths through the air, guided by scents and faint echoes, part of another layer of life that goes mostly unnoticed. Relaxing science for overthinking minds. At night, sometimes means remembering that the world is allowed to be complicated without your supervision. Everything you have touched today, door handles, keyboards, cups, rails, has left microscopic traces that will go on to mingle with countless others. Streets will be washed by rain or street cleaners. Dust will settle on shelves and screens. Seeds will fall into quiet corners. Reality will keep quietly knitting itself together while you rest. Even your own home is part of this weaving. The air in your room contains molecules that once passed through forests, through the lungs of strangers, through oceans and mountainsides. The water you drank today may include atoms that were once locked in ancient ice, then freed, then cycled through rivers and clouds. Nothing here is truly isolated. Every tiny world we visited, dust droplet cell circuit neuron, is connected to others by slow, patient loops. When worries grow large, they can make your life feel like the entire universe, as if everything important begins and ends with your deadlines, your decisions, your mistakes. But lying here, you can gently set those worries beside the image of this turning planet with all its small passengers. Not to minimize your pain or your responsibilities, but to remember that you are one thread in a much larger tapestry, and that tapestry is not held up by your effort alone. Somewhere tonight, someone else is listening to their own soft story, or staring at their ceiling, or standing quietly under a street lamp, feeling the same mix of tiredness and restless thinking. They too are made of atoms that once burned in stars and wandered through dust. They too are carried by this spinning sphere through a dark that is not empty, but filled with more tiny worlds than any one mind can track. You are not required to carry all of this. You don't even have to stay awake until the story finishes. You can let go in the middle, trusting that the planet will keep turning the air, will keep mixing the circuits, will keep humming, and your own brain will keep resetting its networks in the background. The job of being conscious can be put down for a while. If you notice your breath slowing, you can let it. If you feel yourself drifting into that foggy in-between space where thoughts stop lining up properly, you can let that too. The layers of tiny worlds we've walked through tonight are still there, whether you think about them or not. Their existence does not depend on your concentration. In a way, they are offering you proof that you are allowed to rest life and matter, and light will continue their work without your guidance. And if this quiet wandering finds it still has one last gentle turn ahead of it, that final step will be a 12th and softest layer where all these images of small worlds dim into the background, and the only task left is to breathe and let the details blur into sleep. The room around you is still the same, but it feels a little softer now, as if the edges of things have stepped back a few quiet steps. Your pillow knows the shape of your head. The blanket has settled into its own slow gravity over your shoulders. Somewhere nearby, the dust speck we've been following all night is still resting on a surface you could touch with your hand, no larger than it ever was, holding its tiny history in complete silence. You don't need any more new facts tonight. You've carried enough information through this day, sorted enough messages, made enough choices. For these last moments, the science itself can become more like background music, a gentle hum beneath something even simpler. The permission to stop trying so hard to be awake, aware, and in control. All the tiny worlds we visited are still here, layered around you like thin, transparent shells. On your skin, invisible cities of microbes are adjusting to the cooling temperature of the night cell by cell. In the air, dust grains are drifting a few millimeters at a time on quiet currents from your breathing. On your nightstand, circuits sleep with one eye open, crystals holding time in microscopic steps. Inside your skull, neurons are falling into slower waves, some of them already surfing the edge of dreams. Far beneath everything, the planet keeps turning with its patient geological heartbeat. In the dark soil, roots and fungi are trading nutrients grain by grain. Out over the oceans, plankton are rising and sinking with the light forming living veils that wrap the water's surface. High above, tiny droplets are forming and fading in clouds that you may never see. All of that is still happening while you are motionless in this small room, in this small patch of night. You are not responsible for any of it. Reality does not need you to stay alert to keep its pieces from falling apart. You have spent so many hours holding everything you could think of in your mind at once: your work, your people, your worries, your plans. For this one stretch of time, you are allowed to hand all of that back to the quiet machinery of the world and let it run without you. If your mind still wants something to gently lean on, it can remember just one small thing: a speck of dust floating in a beam of light. Inside it, tiny ridges and valleys. On it, invisible forests and passengers. Around it, droplets that can form lenses that can bend light. Within it, atoms that have been inside stars and leaves and oceans. All of that in something that most people would blow away without a thought. You are allowed to treat yourself with the same soft curiosity. From the outside, you might look like just another tired adult, lying in bed, phone nearby, another silhouette in another dark window. But inside, you are full of layers, memories, ideas, quiet strengths that hardly anyone sees, scars that tell stories no one else has read. You have survived days that felt impossible. You have carried worries heavier than your own body feels right now against the mattress. Your strange, overactive mind is not broken. It is beautifully wired for rare curiosity. It notices details other people step over. It asks questions when the world would rather move on. It lies awake at odd hours, wandering through possibilities. All of that can make life harder at times, but it also means that even a dust speck can become a universe for you, and a simple, sleepy science story can feel like a soft place to hide in for a while. Tonight, you don't need to fix that mind or silence it by force. You only need to give it something gentle to rest against the way a wave rests for a moment against a rock before sliding back into the sea. If your thoughts still wander, they can wander through these tiny worlds we've touched. Water bears on pillow fibers, droplets turning to mist, electrons waiting in circuits, neurons cooling into slow rhythms, the earth itself moving through space like a patient breathing animal. Details can start to fade now. Names, numbers, processes can blur into one another until they are no sharper than a dream. You don't have to keep track of which part was which, or what came from stars and what came from soil. Everything can slide into the same quiet background, a soft awareness that reality is stranger and kinder than it looks in your most anxious moments. If your eyes are closed, you can let them stay that way. If they are half open, you can let the room go out of focus, colors and shapes smearing into a comforting vagueness. Your breath can keep doing what it has been doing all along, in and out, without any supervision from you. Each exhale can feel like putting something down. Each inhale can feel like permission to be exactly as you are. You are not alone in this habit of listening to relaxing weird facts for nighttime minds. Scattered across the planet in other rooms and other beds, there are people whose brains also fizz too much at midnight, who also find comfort in knowing that the universe is full of small impossibilities. You are part of that quiet, hidden tribe, connected not by noise or drama, but by this simple need to be gently distracted until sleep can find you. Whenever your strange, beautiful mind needs a soft place to rest again, you know where to find this little corner of the universe. The dust will still be here. The tiny worlds will still be working in the background. The voice of sleepy science will still be ready to walk beside you, taking slow, harmless steps through oddness until your thoughts loosen their grip and you slip under. For now, nothing more is required of you. The story can stop anywhere. The images can fade completely. You can let go in the middle of this line, or the next, or the one after that, and the tiny worlds will simply keep turning without you holding a place for you until morning.